The rights of the individual versus the rights of the state. Entropy versus stagnation. And allowing suicide rather than unbearable being. We have a lot to talk about. Okay, let's go ahead and start this episode with a couple of disclaimers. The one I want to get out right at the beginning is there is no way I can do justice to this episode and still talk about its main core theme. You know what? Cancel that. Edit out. Let's go ahead and do this while we're at it. There we go. Okay. And let's pull out my notes. Get my notes ready. Alright, God, okay. Take two. Before we begin, I really want to get a couple of disclaimers out right off the front here. I know I do that a lot. As some of you may know, I have a rule that I've had for years and years, long before I ever did these videos or the blog that preceded it, and that rule is I don't like to talk about charged issues. That's generally the term I refer to it as. Now, what a charged issue is, for those of you who have not been following me long or don't know what I'm talking about, is something that is, I know this is going to sound weird, emotionally charged, something that people generally can't discuss but can only argue. Now, of course, I am generalizing, but in my life experience, we're talking in the 80 percentile or higher of people cannot actually discuss such topics without getting so emotionally overwrought over it that it stops being a discussion, and, yelling or lack of thinking happens, or both. And I'm going to phrase it that way, lack of thinking, because that's actually what bothers me about it. I don't mind if you get emotionally charged about it or something. But the moment you stop thinking about it and just start flinging out rhetoric or just, ignoring thought processes or whatever, then I'm not interested in talking about this anymore with you. Now, that's just my opinion. That's the way I've always been. However, there is no way I can do this episode justice without talking about one of its core themes. And that is that of suicide. I don't want to talk about it too much on its own merits. I'm only going to try to discuss it within the confines of the episode, but I do want to mention something right off the bat here, and that is that if you do not feel comfortable hearing a discussion about suicide, this is probably an episode to skip. To be perfectly blunt, I don't actually want to talk about it, because, well, for those of you who know Greek, I'm going to toss out a word here. That word is ginosko. I ginosko suicidal people, suicidal thoughts, whatever you want to call it, the very concept thereof. And that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm also one of those people who understands the difference between wanting to die and being willing to die, and understanding the distinction between those two. But that is one of the core themes of this episode, of which there are several. I only mentioned a few in my little intro bit there. It's actually one of the rare examples where Voyager set out to do something, good, set out with a good premise, and actually did something with it. That may or may not actually sound amusing, but if you think about it, one of the things Voyager has always been, up until now, is good premise, bad execution. I mean, the whole series of Voyager could be described as good premise, bad execution. But this is a rare example of good premise, good execution, and there are several main topics that are discussed throughout this episode. I mentioned those big ones: the rights of the individual versus the rights of the state, the concept of stagnation versus the concept of entropy, which I'll talk about only a little bit, but it is relevant. The idea of suicide, whether or not it should be allowed, whether it is condoned, that kind of a thing. It also kind of ties in with capital punishment in there. I'll get to that later. And there are a few other main plot points in this as well. For example, Q himself actually does have a bit of a character arc. RQ, by the way. I'll be referring to them as Q and Quinn for simplicity. That's generally the accepted terminology, and that's what we're going with. Anyways, Q's character arc through this is significant. And there's also another topic that is, it's only brushed on, but it's still sufficiently important to the overall plot and to the other four topics that I feel it's worth mentioning, and that is the idea of the ripple effect. And it's in an examination of how it is used both deliberately and accidentally. We're going to start this episode with a little bit of a commentary. As some of you may or may not know, I do a lot of research for these episodes, behind the scenes stuff. And there is a colossal amount of information on certain episodes, usually the episodes where someone popular or something popular happened within it. This is no exception. It's well known that John Delancey tends to talk a lot off-screen about the stuff he does, so you can generally learn a lot about either individual episodes or works he has been in from him, because he'll talk about it, and he'll talk about it freely and often. And John Delancey had a lot to say about this episode. I'm going to go ahead and try and lighten the mood a little bit here by sharing one of the comments he made, which I think is absolutely hilarious. Actually, this is kind of going to be a little trivia section, but bear with me here. First of all, I just like mentioning that his agent contacted him while he was in the middle of another production, I might add, and said, "We've got a Star Trek script for you." And he actually thought he was going to be going back on Deep Space Nine. He had actually not watched Voyager at all. Not even one bit. Had not seen a single episode of the series, so all he knew was what it was Star Trek. That's despite another fact, which I'll get to in just a little bit. But regardless, when he did this episode and saw how it was performed and how it was executed, John Delancey said that this must be a... I'm sorry, I can't even say it without laughing. This must be a wonderfully fine series based on the quality of this episode. Now, I know this is kind of a divisive episode amongst fans, and there's a lot of reasons why, but in my opinion, Death Wish is one of the 10 out of 10s of Voyager. We've actually already covered one, Meld, and I think the next one will actually be Warlord, if I'm not mistaken. And then we'll get to Scorpion, and then there's the one whose name I can't think of, and then there's the other one whose name I can't think of. And those are basically it. Those 5 or 6, however many that is, are what I consider to be the 10 out of 10s of Voyager. And I just find it funny that one of the absolute best the series has was the only thing he'd ever seen of the series. Oh, this must be a great show, given this. I find myself wondering if John Delancey had starred in Threshold, what he would have thought about Voyager. Or if he would have starred in Threshold. Anyways. The other little trivia fact I want to toss out there is that John Delancey and Kate Mulgrew are actually friends outside of work, and actually have been friends for as of this episodes, which was over a decade ago. But as of this point, they'd been friends for 15 years, so they'd been friends for quite a while. And Kate Mulgrew had a whole social life thing she had been doing at the time. I don't know if she's still doing this, but she was really big on dinner parties, and she was really big on socializing, what we would probably now call social networking, where she would intentionally try to get people with talent or skill or ideas connected with other people with skill or talent ideas. It's just something she did kind of because it was fun for her, something she enjoyed as a hobby. And she literally campaigned to get John Delancey onto Voyager in some fashion. Even if he wasn't playing Q, she really wanted to get him on her show on Voyager. And so she, on more than one occasion, would set up a meeting between John Delancey and his family and the Pillars, the people who are really Michael Pillar, all those guys, and so forth and so on. I just think it's funny because one of the things that is interesting about Voyager is that every now and again, someone involved with making that show spontaneously grows a brain. I know that sounds really derogatory, but as of this point in time, Voyager still had not really found its footing. Not until Season 3, when there was the big shake-up behind the scenes, and I'll talk about that more when we get to Season 3, did Voyager really actually start to find itself. So, Voyager was kind of just manhandled, mishandled, and unhandled. It's where the hands go away, but you're still trying to carry it with the stumps of your arms. It was really unpleasant. And, long story short, even under those circumstances, Michael Pillar and several other of the creative staff on Voyager said flat out, we cannot have Q just show up without explanation. And I applaud them on that. Their big thing, I love this, because if you think about this kind of sounds like I'm saying this like a joke, but the creators of Season 1 and 2 Voyager said, we can't do this unless we do it in a way that makes sense. Yes, really. I mean, think about that for a moment. Think about the irony of that situation. But Long and the short of it was, the reason it took them so long to get Q out there was because they wanted a solid, good reason for him to be out there. They didn't want to just have him snap himself up and show up. That wasn't enough for them. And so I applaud them on that. But Michael Piller personally also insisted on one other thing. And I love this, because Michael Piller is recognized something that most Trek fans, Trekkers and Trekkies alike, had recognized for ever since TNG ended, and that was that Q's story arc had effectively finished. He started off in Encounter at Farpoint as the judge and the cynical, judgmental. I'm trying to look for another word, but really judgmental works. The judgmental, negatively thinking antagonist. And then over the course of TNG, he ended in All Good Things, still in the judge's position, but as our advocate. We, humanity, and Picard in particular, had won him over, and he had shifted from the worst kind of villain to the best kind of ally. His arc had completed. So bringing Q back was going to be tricky. And they wanted to do something specific with it. So that was the other requirement. It had to make sense, and they had to do something with him. This is, and forgive me, we're still kind of going in behind the scenes thing, but another little bit of trivia. It was actually Michael Piller's son who came up with the idea at the dinner table, of all things, and basically ended up doing there's a term for this, and I can't think of it right now, forgive me, but it's the first draft of the script and selling that to the crew. Now, I got a couple other things of trivia here I want to fling out here. If you'll give me a moment. Let's see, I already said that. This was also the first episode in which Kate Mulgrew finally had some creative control over her character. And I'm going to try really hard not to point this out on an episode-to-episode basis, but if you look at Janeway from Caretaker till now, and then from now onwards, you'll notice that from Caretaker to now, her character is wildly inconsistent, and just kind of does this thing. And from this point and on, she's going to be a lot more consistent, it's going to be a lot more static. I'm not going to say she's a better captain per se. She's still going to make plenty of mistakes, and there are still few instances where it's just, mind-bogglingly stupid, like the Equinox. But overall, the presentation of Captain Janeway is going to be a lot better from this point on, and it is because Kate Mulgrew was allowed some creative control over her character. This is something that's actually been a very common thing on Star Trek, and is a common thing on television in general. At a certain point in time, a given actor is allowed some creative, it is some, not full, some creative control over their character, because and this has been true since like the 60s, I want to say, is one of the earliest examples of this. This is true because the actors are believed, after a certain period of time, to know their character well enough, to actually be able to say, well, that's not what I would do, that kind of a thing. There are a couple of exceptions to this, but I'd just like to point out really quick another example of this, and that would be Captain Archer, who was played by Scott Bakula over on Enterprise, who finally got his creative control. I forget the exact episode, but it was towards the beginning of Season 3. And frankly, that also, it's another thing that's incredibly apparent and visible, in my opinion. But let's move on. There's one joke that was cut from this. We're going to talk about one last thing behind the scenes before we go on. This is a truly rare episode of Star Trek in general, never mind Voyager, because it has no B or C or D or F or G or Z plot. It just has the A plot. Now, the reason why is, number one, we've got 5 big concepts to talk about that are all kind of integrally tied together. You cannot eject any one of these 5 and still maintain the overall message of the episode. So that's the first reason. But the second reason is they were so over on their time budget. This is kind of funny timing, because not too long ago I released a video saying, do you want me guys to start doing this to myself, to start shortening my videos? This is the exact problem this episode ran into. They were over their time budget by I forget the exact number. It was like 16 minutes or something like that, which is huge for a 44-minute show, by the way. So they had to chop about 16 minutes of footage out of this after they'd filmed. And that's like pulling teeth when you get down to it. Again, speaking from experience, I've actually done a lot of editing work. And after a certain point, it's like, well, we've gotten rid of all the excess, we've gotten out all the filler, we've saved seconds by getting rid of pauses in here and there. Now we have 3 more minutes we have to get rid of, so you have to start actually pulling scenes out. And I just want to mention that because it was such a phenomenally produced concept that they had. This is such a rarity. They actually had more content to use than they knew what to do with, basically. In actual fact, there are two scenes, I'll try to point them out, but I might forget, that were recorded for this episode that will actually be present in later episodes effectively as filler, because they can be slotted in and out without real issue. Not that I really am a fan of filler, but I have to give them props for some degree of creativity on that. That's solving the budget and time issue relatively well. Do I have any? Oh yes, one last tidbit here. Holy moly! There's an unfortunately lost line that is so wonderfully meta, and I love it because it only would work with Q. Q is the only one who could pull off a meta joke in Star Trek, but he had a line to Tuvok where he said, "If it wasn't for Q," speaking of Quinn here, "if it wasn't for Q, you would have been the chief engineer on the Star Trek, the Enterprise." Now, the joke there, for those of you who don't know, is that Tim Russ, the actor who plays Tuvok, was actually like number 2 or number 3 in line to play Geordi over on Star Trek Next Generation. And yeah, I just liked that joke. I just thought I'd toss that out there. Moving on. What do we got? Okay, so now I think we're finally going to start getting the episode itself. There's one other thing I want to comment on, because I just kind of want to get this out of the way, okay? I have heard a lot of discussion about the idea of how bad of an idea it was to bring Q into Voyager because of one flat reason. Q can snap Voyager home. Why doesn't he? Now, John Delancey himself, who has a pretty much of a handle on his character, believed that that was a silly question. He's actually answered this question at conventions more than once, and his answer is always the same: why would he? John Delancey always envisioned they would actually throw in a scene where Janeway would say, "Will you take us home?" and Q would say, "No, why would I?" And there would be several reasons for that. In John Delancey's opinion, one would be the obvious, why would I lift my finger to help you? And two would be because of the events that happen in the Delta Quadrant. We'll talk about that more a little bit later, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, so let's really finally start talking about the episode. This episode has two ridiculous things happen in it. One I can allow and one I can't. And I mentioned my Voyager rewrites in all these episodes. I'm just going to mention my rewrite when we get to that second ridiculous thing, the thing I can't allow. But let's just go ahead and get the first ridiculous thing out of the way right off the bat. They encounter a meteor, which is obviously an anomaly because it doesn't behave like a meteor at all, even though it looks like a meteor in every way. Okay, fine. Let's transport a chunk of this non-meteor onto our ship. And so they teleport Quinn. They teleport AQ out of AQ prison using the transporter. Now, on the one hand, the Trekker in me is just going, what? But on the other hand, the writer in me has actually spent a large amount of time, not just in general when I've watched this episodes before, but when I was preparing for this particular video I'm doing right now, I actually spent a lot of time trying to think of another way around that. And to be perfectly frank, anything else is either as stupid or stupider. So, okay, fine. You beam him out of the Q prison. Fine. Let's just get the episode started. So, the next thing that happens is Janeway finds out that there is Q aboard, and naturally she assumes it's Q, not Quinn. The very first thing she does is calls for red alert. I hate to sound like I'm nitpicking, but really? Q is aboard and you're calling for red alert? That's like... I can't even come up with an analogy for that because there isn't one. I mean, that's like being... Let's say you're in a spacesuit and you're hovering at safe distance from a star. I know, just bear with me here. And you're like, okay, I'm here. Oh god, the star's going supernova and will in 3 seconds. Quick, shield your eyes. Insert goggles joke here. What's the point? Oh, one of the things I always liked about Picard's approach to Q was that she always, always just was like, yeah, okay, it's Q again. Hi. That being said, I actually feel like this was done deliberately because we do see a little bit of Janeway in the episode. I mentioned Kate Mulgrew's interference here. We do see a little bit more of Janeway as a person in this episode, in more ways than one. And one of the ways we see it is how completely differently she acts around Q. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So it could have been hinting about that if I was inclined to be kind. I'm not going to talk about this in detail right now, but I do like the idea that Quinn's attempt to commit suicide actually had really unexpected events. We learn later that Quinn actually set off the Vulcan-Romulan War as a result of one of his suicide attempts. Whew. But in this episode, we actually see one specific screw up, and that is all the men on the ship go away, and for whatever reason, he can't bring them back. As weird as this sounds, that not only made perfect sense to me, but I really like its application. It's the idea of what happens when you move the immovable object, basically. And the general concept is, or rather, the general answer is, things break. Things just kind of stop working right, you know? And so I like the thing that just stuff just kind of happened when he did that. In this case, all the men just kind of go, shh. And he can't even fix it. It takes an experienced Q to actually fix that. I also really like the scene. It's relatively short, but the scenes, I guess I should say, where Q and Quinn are basically playing tag across the cosmos. I like these for three big reasons. Well, four, actually. The fourth reason that I just thought of is they're very well directed, so props to that. The first reason is I really like just the general appeal and idea of being able to do whatever. As a writer, I really enjoy that idea, and as a viewer, I really enjoy seeing someone be able to stretch like that. Where does a Q hide from another Q? And the answers they come up with were as a subatomic molecule, in the very beginning of the universe, and as an ornament on a tree. And I love the variance there. It's wonderful. Second reason I like it is that it's indicative of Janeway's approach to the situation. She is just being overwhelmed and tough by this, and she literally is facing a situation she doesn't know how to handle. And you can kind of see it on her face. You can see Mulgrew's portrayal of this, and she talks about this a little bit in her interviews. She was portraying someone who was dealing with something that was completely beyond her. And while Picard always had that absolute, Picard practically was the immovable object whenever he dealt with Q. Part of that was due to experience, and part of that was due to Picard's mentality and personality. Janeway is nothing like that. And so instead, she is just being overwhelmed by this and ends up falling back on her training, on her beliefs, on her principles, and saying, okay, look. And then she finally tries to basically muscle her way into the situation. I could talk about Janeway a bit more here, but I'll stop for the moment. The third thing and the final thing I like about this scene is it's an interesting portrayal of Q, not Quinn. Just to make sure, I'm trying really hard to make sure I'm calling him Q and Quinn so I can keep this distinct. But Q, our Q, John Delancey, because he is more than happy to go on this chase. At any point in time, he could have just randomly flung Quinn back into the prison. You'll notice he doesn't. He bothers to stand around. He bothers to talk to him. He bothers to engage in this chase. Why? Well, we're not really going to cover why yet, but it is without question he did so on purpose, even though he had the power and the authority backing him to just fling Quinn back in his prison and say, bye. If you really want to think about it, Q, and this is an interesting thing to me, Q could have found out that Quinn got out, shown up, fixed things, wiped their memory, Quinn back in prison, on with his business. But he didn't. And he didn't on purpose. That's all I'm going to say about that. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. Quinn has a scene with Tuvok where he talks about how the Q are not omnipotent. This scene was such a moment of triumph for so many theory crafters. For those of you who are not aware, back when Next Generation was still coming out, a lot of fans, Trekkers, Trekkies, people who idly like the show, had a really big theory going on at the time that all of Q's power and all of Q's knowledge was basically not omnipotence, or whatever you want to call it. That while the Q's may or may not actually be energy beings, they were just significantly more advanced than we were. And that's all. As opposed to the generally accepted idea, which is basically they're omnipotent super beings. Now, or to quote Farscape, godlike aliens. Now, granted, we see a lot of godlike aliens throughout the Star Trek years, but the Q have always trumped everything else, right? This episode was such a triumph for those people because it finally confirmed that idea, that the Q are in fact much more advanced, much more powerful, but are not actually omnipotent or not actually omniscient, etc., etc., etc. And that they do actually have vulnerabilities. This was a scene that was very, very much thought to be cut. They were really wanted to cut this scene because of how long it is, but they just couldn't bring themselves to do so because that piece of information that was put across was so important to what at the time was going to be a plot arc involving the Q and Voyager. I think now is a good time to talk about this. Those of you who have watched my Voyager episodes know that there are 3 episodes of Voyager I skip every time I rewatch this series. Alliances, Threshold, and Q in the Gray. There are 3 episodes, Q episodes across Voyager. The third one is tepid and boring and poorly written. The second one is Q in the Gray. Really, I don't know what else to add to that. We'll talk about that when we get there, but let's just say it's a bad episode and leave it at that. It's such a damn tragedy because this episode is so amazing in every single way. And it could have led to something incredible in Q in the Gray. Or, whatever they ended up calling it. But instead it turned into Q in the Gray. But I have to. Oh God, I hate myself for this. Knowing what is to come. But looking in the moment, looking at this episode, I have to applaud them for wanting to do more with the Q. Rather than just making them the omnipotent super beings, they wanted to actually do something with them. Believe it or not, this is something Voyager's creative staff actually had semi-frequently, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we get to an episode called Unity. Let's just go ahead and move on. Let's go ahead and talk about Q's dual nature really quick. There are 2 really interesting things about Q in his portrayal. Ever since TNG is finished, I gotta stress that. One is what we're just gonna call the trickster personality, because I don't have a better word for it. The guy who likes to play games, the guy who likes to entertain himself, the guy who doesn't mind doing a chase across reality and cosmos in order to capture the guy that he'd have captured in 3 seconds, to use one example. That is very much strongly on show, and it's always the face Q wears. But on several occasions we see a layer past that, and that is, for lack of a better term, the Q who has an a modicum of respect. Respect for others, respect for individuals, respect for concepts, that kind of a thing. And we'll talk about this concept a little bit more later, but I find it interesting that this episode very adamantly shows, and they never say this once, but they imply it so heavily it cannot be unintentional, that after the events of All Good Things, the Q Continuum was not happy with Q and his assistance of Picard and humanity and, the Alpha Quadrant, or rather the galaxy as a whole as a result of that. And so now we see Q, for the first time really, cowed. We see a Q who is on the leash, and he is constantly still doing the games, putting on the face, but unlike usual, he's not just doing it for his own entertainment or just to do something different. He's doing it because a small part of him is rebelling against the leash that he now wears. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. I also like the fact that this episode, oh my God, it actually bothered to have continuity. There's one of the things that tends to be forgotten a lot is a woman called Amanda Rogers. If you are a Trekker or even a Trekkie, you probably know that name. If you don't, I'll explain very simply. Amanda Rogers was the daughter of 2 Q couples. Really, I feel like that's all I need to say on that. She had her own episode in which she was the star, an absolute star of the episode. We'll talk about that when we get to TNG, but the long and the short of it is she is basically forgotten in every way, sense, and form after that. Even though several issues that have been brought up since then, including the ones in Voyager, really directly pertain to her situation. So I do at least like the fact that they brought up the fact that Amanda Rogers existed in this episode. They never used the name, because using the name would involve copyright fees, basically. Or not copyright fees, there's a word for that. Royalty fees. But, the eternal bane of television. But they do at least mention it existed, so yay for a nod to continuity. I'm going to read a direct quote for you that Tuvok says. Because at this point, I can't avoid the suicide topic anymore. I really can't. Tuvok asks Q regarding Quinn and the Q situation, and do you find nothing contradictory in a society that outlaws suicide but practices capital punishment? I don't know exactly how this works in other parts of the globe, and Lord knows I got tons of European and Australian and Asian viewers on here, but I know that here in the States, that's pretty much how it is. Suicide is illegal. and we practice capital punishment. And that line was deliberately thrown in. It was actually a line that was fought for by Tim Russ himself to make sure it stayed in, because he himself felt that it was a good point. Now, according to Tim Russ's interview, he didn't actually mean to make this a commentary on real life. He just meant that to him, that seemed kind of wonky, that the Q were willing to murder, well, kill, their own people, but were disallowing them from committing suicide. But you cannot look at that statement without looking at real life and seeing that we have the exact same situation here. Granted, it's not quite as black and white as it is there, because that's fiction, and real life is never as black and white as fiction. But the long and the short of it is, I like that line because it emphasizes the thing that always pisses me off most about people who don't understand suicide or suicidal people, and that is that people just don't. People are so damned intolerant of the very concept. They look at you like you're diseased. They look at you like there's something so horribly wrong with you, and they take it to such a severe extreme. Like, oh my God, we need to do horrible, horrible things to you to convince you not to kill yourself. I gotta be blunt. I have never been more suicidal in my life than when I was on suicide watch. Because it was so horrible being there, and they treat you so terribly there, and they abuse you. And I don't mean intentionally. I don't mean abuse like, oh, you're my bitch now or whatever. No, I mean they treat you like you are some kind of retarded, insignificant, less than human. They treat you like you are this fragile little thing, and they have to take care of you by chaining you down as hard as they can, sometimes literally, and making you walk around naked just to make sure you can't actually do anything about that. Oh, we don't care if you have personal body issues. Take all your clothes off in front of all these people. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to get too upset about this. But my point I'm trying to get to here, and this is something the episode itself does address, is that too many people look at suicide, or people who are suicidal, or people who have been suicidal, or people who are willing to die, which is different than people wanting to die. And people just don't know how to deal with that, I've noticed. They don't know how to comprehend that. They don't know how to compute it. And so they just kind of break, and they react in such weird and often horrible ways. One of the truths I've often found is that people who are genuinely suicidal, nobody's going to notice until they do, or until they change their mind. Because people who are truly suicidal usually have a brain on their heads, and they keep it quiet. Because what's the alternative? To suffer that kind of persecution and pain and misery and fear and loathing? And all sorts of other horrible things I'm not even going into? No. I used to have a saying, and I have actually been yelled at for it because I've been accused of being intolerant, which I find hilarious, by the way. And that saying is, a truly suicidal person is not someone who you're going to find the note until after, or if at all. Because it's not a cry for attention when someone really means it. Quite the contrary. Now do keep in mind, I am actually trying really hard not to discuss the value or a lack of value in suicide itself. That's a topic I just want to leave alone. What I am bringing up is, and what this episode brings up, is how charged of a topic it is on the first surface of it. We see in Janeway someone who is emotionally appalled by the idea of killing yourself. We see in Tuvok someone who acknowledges the logic in accomplishing it as necessary. We see in Q someone who is afraid of the consequences of it, someone who would be damaged by it. And we see in Quinn someone who wants nothing else, someone who is reasonable and rational and is determined, this is the path I choose. It's probably one of, I can't believe I'm saying this, but it's probably one of the most well-accomplished examinations of the topic I've actually ever seen in fiction. And one of the things, forgive me for skipping ahead here, but later in the episode, after Quinn is given his mortality, he has been, stripped of his powers and blah blah blah. Janeway gives an impassioned plea for life. You are mortal now, and things can happen that you've never experienced before, that you've never done before. Now everything is different for you. I implore you, please keep living. Please. And you can just see, Mulgrew does such a phenomenal job of this. I can't even put words into it. You can see the earnestness in her face because she's not treating him. I love this too, because she's not treating him like he's diseased. She's not doing all those other horrible things of persecution and abuse that I just mentioned. She is simply pleading her case to him, that she believes in life, and that she urges him to consider that as a possibility. And you could see how wounded she is by the circumstance when she learns that he disagrees. Let's go ahead and move on to this topic. I don't think I actually have anything else to talk about with regards... God, I have so many notes on this episode. Actually, I do have one other thing to talk about with regards to the suicide topic, and I kind of want to get this all out right in the row. Later on, after the first hearing, there's a recess, and Tuvok and Quinn are discussing things, and Quinn mentions how he's glad Tuvok understands. Tuvok says he doesn't. Now, keep in mind, Tuvok is someone... Vulcans in general are people who do find suicide under certain circumstances, under certain stimuli, when properly prepared for blah, 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 to be acceptable, societally, as a culture, as a species. And Tuvok... So that's not the problem. However, Tuvok himself, based on the evidence he has seen, does not actually believe that it is right in this circumstance. First of all, I love that because that shows the Vulcan mindset in a nutshell. If the formula of everything that is involved in your life does not add up to you should cease your life, then you shouldn't cease your life. And Tuvok gets this across so coldly and bluntly. I do not see any reason a life as incredible as yours, forgive me for the paraphrase, should be ended simply because you're disgruntled, I believe is more or less his exact quote. I messed up a few lines in there because I suck, but forgive me. That's what he tries to get across in his words. And this, of course, leads to Quinn trying to explain the true nature of why he wants this to end. And we'll get to that later, because that's basically a different topic when it comes down to it. Suffice it to say, for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to accept that Quinn has good enough reason to at least consider the idea of suicide. Ignoring all other thoughts on the matter, at least, we're going to start with that as a base, because we kind of have to in order to discuss this. What I like about that scene between Quinn and Tuvok is it is so accurate, because Quinn has such a hard time explaining himself to Tuvok. This is another scene that Tim Russ fought to be in there, and for, again, this kind of a reason. Because Quinn has failed to adequately describe why he wants his life to end. And Tuvok, despite all his logic and knowledge and understanding of the very concept, doesn't get it at all. That scene was put in there. This isn't me reading too much into this. Again, this is a deliberate thing. Because in real life, suicidal people have a tremendously hard time explaining why. Really getting across the why they are the way they are at that time or in general to other people. You try to explain, again, I hate to say this, but this is speaking from personal experience and Genosco, not just from myself, but from others I have known. In fact, I've actually been a comfort to several people I've known who have been suicidal, because I get it! Because I've been there. Because I do actually Genosco this. I do actually comprehend this concept. And suicidal people have such a hard time talking to people about how they feel because other people don't get it. And you can't really explain why you feel that way to someone. You just kind of fail with words. You use words like, well, I feel depressed, or I feel sad, or I feel hurt, or I feel oppressed, or I feel like 1,000 weights are constantly crushing me into paste, But these words fail to get across how you actually feel and why you feel that way. And so I love this scene's inclusion because it addresses that important point. That there is this communication barrier between these two types of people. and it is one that is so hard to pierce. You know? Now, with that, I swear I'm done with the suicide topic. I don't have anything else to talk about. I'm sorry I got a little personal there. Let's talk about Voyager. Let's talk about Star Trek. First of all, I'd like to say that the addition of Jonathan Frakes on this was awesome. This is actually, I believe, the only time Frakes shows up on Voyager. It's something he had been willing to do on more than one occasion. He actually, at this point in his life, he was like, yes, I'm totally cool with appearing on Deep Space Nine or Voyager. And he ended up appearing on both, so props to that. But and pretty much right after this, he would basically shift full tilt into directing, right? And then Enterprise would come around, and other horrible stuff would happen. Let's just not go into that. The point is, Frakes is awesome. I actually really like Jonathan Frakes. He's a goofball in real life. He's hilarious. I don't know if I've actually met him once met him. I've seen him in person at a convention back in where was that? You know, I actually don't remember. Whatever, it doesn't matter. And he is just a hilarious guy. He's very charismatic. He knows what he's doing. He's a decent actor, all things considered. He's a great director. And his inclusion on the show was actually a really nice touch, I think, and really helped bring some of the connection to Star Trek as a whole into Voyager. Something that, if you'll forgive me for being blunt, I feel was very sorely needed. Up until this point, with a few exceptions, Voyager felt very detached from the rest of Star Trek. Now you may say, well, that's the point. Well, let me finish my sentence to really get across the point. It felt very detached from the rest of Star Trek in a good way, or rather, all of Star Trek's good things, but it felt very attached to all of Star Trek's bad things. A lot of the negative things that had started to crop up in late TNG and early DS9 really were emphasized in Voyager, mainly because of the creative teams that were involved. And yet it had none of the spark and none of the essence and none of the connection to some of the things we really loved about Trek. So having Frakes there, I feel, really helped add just one little thread to connect the two and help bring Voyager into more of a personal connection. I'd also want to comment on something that I know people are expecting me to comment on if you've seen this episode, and that is the Woodstock guy. Now, I don't remember the guy's name. I apologize. It is actually the name for the character, not Barry Waddle, that's the other guy. The name of the character is actually the name of the actor. They liked his name so much that they used it. They wanted to be ambitious with this scene. Jonathan Frakes was always their first pick. They wanted three people who affected history. They wanted Jonathan Frakes for reasons I'll get to in a moment, playing Riker. They wanted Bill Gates to show up, they wanted Henry Kissinger, and they wanted Frank Sinatra, along with a few others that I'm not going to bother listing. They got none of those, obviously, so instead they got the gentleman who played Sir Isaac Newton in TNG, and they got this guy. This is the other mistake I mentioned earlier that I would completely rewrite. If nothing else, oh my god, I would like to say I get where they were going with this. Kinda. I mean, they have the development and adaptation of math and physics in its oldest form and its application in the world. They had the salvation of the entire Federation from the Borg, which was deliberately mentioned, I might point out. And then they had the guy who made Woodstock successful, and also then got married and had 4 kids. You see the discrepancy here? I feel like what they were probably going for was trying to have a human element to show how Quinn had affected even the individuals, along with the grand scale of things. And I feel like if they were going that route, they should have had more of an in-between thing. Like between Riker and that thing, which, again, we'll talk to in a moment, and this guy, they should have had something a little bit more in between, and if I was rewriting this, I probably would add something a little bit, different in there. Try to emphasize, this person who met this person, and that made this person happy, and then this whole family experienced all this. It was something like that, rather than going from physics to salvation of the Federation to Woodstock. Anyways, do I have any other notes before I go into this? No. Okay. I actually have 2 notes about what is about to be mentioned. The first is very, very important because it's one of those 5 themes I mentioned, the concept of the ripple effect. This is something that was deliberately put into the episode. If you could see some of the cut footage or read the script in my cases, which is what I did of the cut scenes, you would understand how this was more emphasized. In the actual episode, the ripple effect is only mentioned like 4 times. Each time it's pretty crucial, but it is only mentioned 4 times. It was more of an impact in the intended full episode. The idea here is that the Q are not omniscient, but they do have a great deal of an idea of how patterns work. And so they would deliberately do things, Q and Quinn especially, would do things specifically to alter a series of events so that things would work out 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now or whatever. In other words, what I'm trying to get across here is that Quinn saved Riker's great-grandfather, whatever it was, in the Civil War, on purpose, specifically so that Riker could defeat the Borg at the Best of Both Worlds battle back in back at Sector 001. That was done deliberately by Quinn for that reason. And I like that because not only does it show the kind of long, it gets across the point the episode that Q himself is making, that Qs in general can have such a long-standing impact. It gets across the point that they can do so deliberately, and it also gets across the fact that several of the Q, especially Quinn himself, do generally have a beneficial benefactor type demeanor to them. They actually want to assist, to aid in the so-called lesser races. Even though he does act very condescending, he nevertheless does so with that intent to aid, to help. And I liked that. And I also like that because, well, we'll talk about the other ripple effects in a moment, because there's a couple more to mention. But one of the other things I really like about this is the mention of the Borg. Now you may say, "Oh, well, you're just a Borg fanboy." No, let me explain what I mean. First of all, yes, I am a Borg fan. I'll admit it. They're probably one of my favorite all-powerful forces from any force of fiction. And you know what I'm talking about. I actually did a whole video about the Borg. You know what I'm talking about. Any given source of fiction tends to have the big doom race, or type of race, or categorization, or whatever. The undead horde, or the Reapers, or the crap, I can't think what they're called in Warhammer. Tyranids, the Tyranids, all that fun stuff. The Borg are my personal favorite of all that type of thing, and for the reasons I already discussed. So yes, I was pretty happy to hear about the Borg, but there's another reason I mentioned this that I didn't know at the time. See, the mention of the Borg, there's actually 2 mentions of the Borg in this episode. Both are deliberate. And again, they insisted on leaving them in for several reasons, because they were deliberately hinting. The reason the Borg was so interesting in Voyager was because the Voyager was in the Delta Quadrant. And we've known since forever that the Borg are from the Delta Quadrant. We've known that since the first episode they appeared in. I'm not talking about Neutral Zone, I'm talking about Q-Who. We have known that since forever. So Voyager running into the Borg is literally an inevitability. And so many of the fans of the show, myself included, when it was coming out, were just waiting for it to happen. So the writers of the show deliberately mentioned the Borg in this episode, twice, actually it was like 5 times in the original script, in order to get across that hint, that foreshadowing. And it was done deliberately, because they were going to do something with the Borg, they just weren't there yet. So I just felt like pointing that out for anybody who didn't know that. There's the suicide mention I already mentioned. There's also one other thing. Okay, so now we're just going to skip forward a bit to where Janeway is talking with Q. And there's the scene where she says he's not a liar, which is hilarious because he's actually lied a ton of times in the series. But whatever, let's not nitpick. The thing I like about that scene is severalfold. First of all, the chemistry, which I'll talk about more later. But second of all, the mention of the Borg. The way she says it is, "Oh, right. And you introduced us to the Borg." And the way John Delancey reacts to that is perfect, because not only is this something we've always suspected, that Q deliberately introduced us to the Borg, specifically so we would have a chance, so we would be ready for them. Because let's face this for a moment. Let's forgive me for segueing. If we hadn't seen the Borg first and spent the following year and a half preparing for the Borg would have just run over us whenever they found us. That incident jump-started so much progression, scientifically, technologically, in terms of weapons, in terms of everything. Turning the phone off. That incident jump-started so much progression for the Federation, and hell, for the whole quadrant, actually, because it affected everyone, not just the Starfleet. He pushed that into motion deliberately. Now, it is arguable he was only doing it because of his interest in Picard and humans in general. But, as we already discussed, this is our second incident of the ripple effect really coming into play. And there's a lot of theories as to what the end goal was of this ripple, but there is absolutely no doubt that Q instigated this ripple by introducing the Enterprise D to the Borg deliberately. And it is my opinion, because we don't know this for sure, that it was done basically to help in Q's own way, in Q's own horrible way. His final speech at the end of QQ sums it up beautifully. Forgive me for not knowing it word for word. Picard says to Q, "I appreciate the lesson, but it could have come without the loss of the lives of 15 of my crew." And Q says, "If you can't take a bloody nose, go home." And then he has this wonderful speech I'm not going to repeat because I can't do it credence without actually memorizing it, but you get the point. So this is another instance of the ripple effect and how a Q's life can impact so much by something so little. Then they go to the continuum. I have a couple of thoughts about the continuum. We'll talk about those in just a moment. First, I want to talk about the Scarecrow. You may say, "What Scarecrow?" In which case, congrats. I actually knew what he was talking about when I saw the interview where Delancey was talking about the Scarecrow, but that's because I have a really good visual memory. There's a scene where, while they're explaining the continuum, that Quinn explains he's even been the Scarecrow. And then Q says, "Oh, we've all done the Scarecrow bit, whatever." John Delancey apparently had very strong feelings about that line. It's one of the reasons he portrays it in the way he does. How you interpret this is up to you, but in John Delancey's explanation of the situation, he believed that that was an examination of reincarnation from a Q's perspective. The idea that rather than willing themselves to turn into the Scarecrow or the dog or whatever, that what had happened is that their current life cycle, or whatever you want to call it, had basically reached a conclusion, and so they simply were cycled into a new one. You see where I'm going with this? And the idea that the Q can basically kind of select what they cycle into next, and the implications of that, the implications of the immortal soul, the implications of all that. I'm not going to go too much into this because we're already talking one horribly volatile topic in this episode. I don't want to talk about two. But I just thought I'd mention that John Delancey himself had pretty strong feelings about that, and that's one of the reasons he mentioned that line the way he did. God, I have so much to talk about now. I just have a note here that literally just says Q Continuum. That's all it says. Oh, where do I begin? Okay, let's take for a moment the assumption that Q and the Gray never existed. Oh my God, I feel a great lift. Weight has been lifted from my heart. Oh, this is wonderful. Okay, I'm just going to savor this for a moment. Okay, Q and the Gray doesn't exist, okay? And I mentioned that pretty specifically because Q and the Gray kind of spits in the face of everything I'm about to say. But the examination of the continuum is fascinating in this episode because it takes what is effectively an extremely alien culture and yet at the same time is so human in its presentation. And for once, I think it was actually a good thing. Star Trek has so commonly taken alien cultures and basically presented them as a format or a type or a stereotype, as the case may be, of an actual culture that exists on Earth. This was actually done deliberately in the original series as an intentional allegory for what was going on at the time with the Cold War and whatnot. So this is not new, but this was done very deliberately on purpose to emphasize how screwed up the Q's nature is, because it was believed by the writers, and John Delancey, again, he had some input on this, that if they kept the continuum too alien, the point they were trying to make would not be understandable. So they needed to make them relatable as a culture, in addition to giving them an alien perspective on that standard societal accepted norm. That's why we have such concepts like the needs of the individual versus the needs of the state, which is something very understandable to a human. But we also have the very alien concept of absolute stagnation. Let me talk about that for a little bit. The idea of perfection is, at its ultimate core, absolute stagnation. However, what we see in the continuum is the ultimate irony of a people who aspire to and claim that they are perfection, the pinnacle of civilized society across the universe, across the cosmos, and yet by definition are not, because they are not absolutely stagnated. Absolute stagnation means exactly that, unchanging. And yet within the Q continuum, there are such things as malcontent. There are such things as dissent. There are just such things as alternate thoughts. There is such thing as oppression. These things do not exist within stagnation, because stagnation is unchanging. And forgive me for keep emphasizing that, but it is really, really important. That's why I call it absolute stagnation. The total lack of change or movement. Thus, the irony of the Q continuum is they are exactly what so many other cultures in real life, Nazi Germany, and several other fictional cultures across all of fiction have said they are, that they are the peak of evolution, of society, of whatever, and yet are provably not. And that's one of the things I really like about this episode in particular, and one of the reasons I feel so bad that it led to Q in the Grave, because that topic was deliberately brought up along with several other threads, specifically to examine the Q continuum in the next episode and the episode after that. And they just kind of threw it away. But the idea on its face is wonderful. The concept of these beings that are so powerful, that have such far-reaching effects from even an individual life, for how much an individual Q can change literally the face of half of a galaxy by a single action. Again, the ripple effect ties into this. And one of the reasons they are so terrified of the consequences of Quinn killing himself is exactly this thing. Their fear of an alteration within their perceived absolute stagnation, when in fact they are not. Because any change to their perceived absolute stagnation would be exactly that, a change, therefore proving that they are not, provably showing the continuum that the continuum is not the pinnacle, that it still needs to, quote-unquote, evolve, that it still needs to change, that it still needs to grow. It is a challenge to the dogma, I think I'm going to use that word, the dogma of the continuum, which we have seen many, many times before, and the dogma of the continuum is very flat. They want this. They want unaltered, static. I think I'm actually going to just go with that word. They want an unaltered, static line. They want nothing changing about it. This is where we are. And this episode is the culmination of that. That idea, that concept. The fact that they are not supreme, the fact that they are not actually in charge of anything, the fact that they are finally being challenged in a way that they can't fully ignore. It is actually ironic that Q was sent to deal with Quinn, because if it was any other Q, this probably would have turned out very differently, wouldn't it have? And that's what I wanted to talk about with regards to the continuum. But there's another irony here. And I mentioned in those 5 plot points that Q himself has a bit of characterization and growth in this. And that is actually partially an examination of his existing character growth. We learn, in an ultimate irony, that Quinn, the person Q is acting as an agent of the continuum to oppress, was himself inspired to work against the continuum's unyielding will by Q. That Q was someone who went out to do things. It's actually ironic because in its own way it portrays the catch-22 of freedom. Because freedom means good and bad. I'm sorry, that really is probably the best definition of freedom I've ever heard. Good and bad, both. You get the good, and you get the bad, and sometimes one outweighs the other, but that's what freedom actually means. And so in Q, we saw someone who went out and did bad things. He was a trickster, he was a prankster, he tormented, he edited, he worked with, he did all sorts of things, many of which were horrible, in an attempt to express and engage in his own freedom against the oppression that the continuum had placed down upon him, that the state had placed down upon him. And that is the catch-22 of its own right, because the alternative, at least in extreme format, is what the continuum represents. That level of total stagnation, no freedom, no change, no action, good or bad, just walking the line forever. That may sound like a horrifying thought to humans, and indeed it should be in my opinion. But it is also worth noting that this is when the alien concept really brings in, because try to imagine doing that literally forever. You specifically, not your family line, not your people, not your culture, not your species. You spend the next Google Plus years walking the line. And that is when the alien nature of the continuum is really brought back into it, and we understand. So it's like a hammer hitting the face, as we understand exactly why Quinn does want to cease, why later on he refuses, even when given mortality, to continue on, because it has to stop. But Quinn isn't just interested in himself. We've talked about this before. He is something of a giving, caring kind of a person, something of a shepherd, actually, if I were to use the term. And so rather than just selfishly trying to do something for his own means, he finally takes his life as, and I'm just going to quote here because I actually wrote this down, my final gift to my people, because he cares about what happens to the rest of the queue. And that sort of thing cannot happen without consequence, which is exactly what Quinn wanted. Consequence. Change. I'd like to take a moment and applaud the art designers and art directors and all the props people who put a ton of work into the Q continuum that we see in this episode, because it's all one of those wonderful things where it's all incredibly blunt and right in your face, and yet it's one of those things that's more interesting, more horrifying, really, if I could use that word, the more you think about it. We see dusty, old, weathered, beaten down outpost on this road that goes forever in both directions. And we see people who are in their pressed, clean, nice outfits, very 50s, very regimental, very unyielding. It's got kind of a 1842 or 19 I lost the year. The Orwell story. God, I can't think of the year all of a sudden. You know what I'm talking about, the oppressive thing, the dystopian thing. It's got very much of that feel to it, Orwellian feel to it. Everyone's, very sticked, very centered, and there's the old, and then there's the new. And those are the really obvious things, but kind of the horrifying thing is watching them playing the arcade game of the Cosmos and playing the little golf game. I can't actually think of the proper name. That's not a croquet, is it? Whatever. Playing that with the globes. Because in that we see exactly what the continuum, if not individual Q, think of everything that is not them as lesser. Something to be played with as a game, or something to be managed. And I feel, and again, this is probably me reading too much into this, but I feel the part of the intent here, in addition to all of this, and in addition to all the obviousness, was to get across the point that the continuum had maintained its absolute nature on top of the food chain for the entire cosmos by deliberately and intentionally maintaining it. In other words, actively keeping down other races, actively keeping down other species, other examples, other exceptions, to ensure that no one ever came to challenge their supremacy, because they were the pinnacle of life. They were the top of the food chain, and that's never changing. You don't get further up than the top. And yet, as we already discussed, they obviously are not. But anyways, I think I'm going to finally move on from the continuum. Forgive me, but I really wanted to talk about that. Let's go ahead and talk about... I've only got a couple more things, really, as weird as this sounds. I've only got a couple more things to talk about. Quinn, I just want to say really quick, Quinn's speech that he gives at the Continuum is beautiful. I love it. Very well written, very well performed. Q's reactions to it are incredible. Props to Mulgrew's reactions to it. In her, we see someone, again, who fundamentally does not believe in or agrees with suicide, and yet she sees, and you could see in her face, a degree of understanding of the level of suffering that this man is going through, and there's just so much empathy and compassion behind her for that. But let's talk about Mulgrew and Delancey. Kate Mulgrew playing Captain Janeway, John Delancey playing Q. As I mentioned earlier, these two have been friends for 15 years at this point in time. And as I mentioned earlier, these two really, really wanted to work together in general, but especially now that she had the Star Trek show and, John Delancey played a regular on Star Trek, so it was like, yes, God, let's make this happen. A lot of the scenes between her and him were actually, they had basically a framework, and then the two of them sat down and wrote them. And you can really tell. You can really tell the way the two of them were presenting themselves to each other, that the chemistry just flows. It is so well presented. They're relatively short scenes, partially because they were cut down, but they were very well presented, very well performed scenes. I want to mention something, two things actually. Three things? No, two things. Two things in particular. One is Q's fascination with Janeway. Now, first of all, we have seen his fascination with another human female before, Vosh, back on TNG, and in many ways I feel it was for the same basic reason. I'll get to that in just a moment. But he presents himself in such a wonderfully insulting, yet not intending to be insulting manner. I don't want to talk about this topic too much, but there is a very strong difference between being intentionally insulting, screw you, buddy, and being unintentionally insulting, where you say something and the other person takes it personally and you didn't mean for them to take it personally, but in that way it tends to be worse because you weren't just saying it to affect them, you actually mean what you say. You see where I'm going with this? And so Q talks about her like she's a microbe, basically, because she is a microbe in comparison to him. Even though he is not the all-powerful super being that we've been led to believe, she's still a microbe in comparison to him. So there's very much that mentality. And he talks about her in such brutal, frank terms, in such vocabulary, while she's right there listening to him talk about her and basically dissect her. And you can see him, he just looks at her with this look of just fascination, like he actually is dissecting her brain and her emotions and her memories and all that stuff. And he offers for her to actually come and journey with him. I mentioned the why and the connection between her and Vosh, and this is it in a nutshell. Even now, with Q with the leash on, Q with the leash of the continuum, and basically cowed, feared. He is afraid for himself, for his existence, for his freedom, and so he has yielded to the will of the continuum. Even under those circumstances, he's always trying to find a way to do something, to do something, to change something, to pass the time, to have some level of entertainment or idealism or something, anything. And so he offers this offer to Janeway specifically for that reason. And it's actually hilarious because in its own right, what he is saying is exactly what we talked about way at the beginning of this video about the offer to get Voyager home, because he mentions that very much in passing. His interest is in Janeway, but he could get them home. The ticker tape parade, all that stuff. So Captain successfully brings her crew home, and then he and Janeway go off and explore the galaxy together until he gets bored with her. And it's actually funny because if you watch the scene, it makes a degree of sense the way it's presented. They actually had to do a rather long rehearsal for this scene, which is very unusual. Most Star Trek episodes only have like a 5 to 6 minute rehearsal. They had like 40 minutes of rehearsal of this scene. Mulgrew and John Delancey did. But one of the things that the two of them were very, very torn on is, would there be a romantic element between between Q and between Janeway? And I find it fascinating to mention this because both actors felt that there would be. Both actors agreed that there would be, based on the characters and based on the way they interact with each other, a romantic element to their relationship. That would end up going really, really badly in Q and the Grey, but let's not get into that. The point is, both actors really were arguing for that kind of a thing, really were arguing for the two of them basically becoming close for their own different reasons. And ultimately, both of them decided, again, together, that as much as they both thought that should happen, and that would happen if this was, real life, if this was how the characters were just reacting and it wasn't a show, for the purposes of a show, they probably should not have that happen. And so that's one of the reasons that scene kind of seems like it's kind of leaning in that direction, and then it just kind of drops off dead, and then Janeway basically tells him to get the hell out. It was actually because they couldn't think of any other way for Janeway to express a no in this case. Because the way it was the idea here was that Janeway herself was tempted, both for her crew and for herself, and that she actually did want that. But then and this is Mulgrew's take on it, she analyzed that thought, realized that she was tempted by this, that she actually wanted this, and the moral, the Starfleet side of her rose up and found that repugnant, and therefore she was now the reason she was so icy when she says get out, and she's like, get away from me, is because she was so ashamed of her own feelings on the matter. Now, I think that actually works really well, so this is like the 4th time I've applauded during this video, but props to Mulgrew and John Delancey for really doing something with that scene. It's a pity it'll go nowhere in the next one. I already mentioned that. God, we're almost done here. Holy moly. My throat's actually kind of sore. I wonder how long I've been talking. I already mentioned Quinn's final words, my final gift to my people. I already kind of talked about that, his intention, his purpose, his reasoning for that. But there is one other thing I want to talk about. This is the last thing, I swear. I swear. The last thing I want to talk about is Q's final scene, John Delancey's final scene. He assisted Quinn in his suicide, and he realized that it's kind of hard to express in words, but basically that Quinn was an inspiration to him, just as Q had been an inspiration to Quinn originally. And Q realized that, in his opinion, given the choice between towing the line, the regimental lack of movement, lack of change order, and the chaos, good and bad, of freedom, he would choose the chaos of freedom. That was more important to him, that his sentience, that his free will chose freedom in this case, that he would prefer that, and he had only been adhering to the stagnant order of the continuum out of fear. And what really knocks him out of it is that Quinn, despite everything, never yielded. Even when he was being threatened with the worst thing imaginable, really, when you think about it, he would not yield. And that that irrepressibleness, to use Q's own word, is what inspires Q to go ahead and do more with himself. And I feel like it's another one of the situations where the Q know that they have sent off a ripple effect. This is the final time it really comes up. Not just with regards to Voyager and the events that will be happening in the future. And they knew for a fact they'd be doing another Q episode. So they had no reservations about having Q say, "We will meet again." Not like, "We'll meet again," or "whenever we meet again." No, he was telling Janeway factually, "We will meet again." And the tone in his voice really gets across the point, because another ripple has just been sent off. And the implications of that, again, ignore Q the Grey, the implications of that are phenomenal. The idea that change has finally irrevocably come to the continuum for the first time, well, let's just say that in a period of time that's so huge, it would be hard to fathom the numbers for it. And that's how we end the episode. Beautiful end, bravo. And we're going to pretend Q and the Grey never happened. Oh, yeah, that wait. So much better. Anyways. Normally I talk about whether I enjoyed an episode more than a now. Let me say without reservation that even though I absolutely adored this episode, especially Meld, Dreadnought, and this, one right after another, great episode, incredible episode, great episode, incredible episode, right after the other, really sold me and basically kept me watching Voyager all the way through to the end of its 7th season. That is basically what kept me, the whole run through. But these 3 episodes. But even ignoring that, rewatching this, really analyzing it, really reading up in the background info, really finding out, what was found on the cutting room floor and all the extra scenes. Oh my God, this episode is so incredible. I'm thinking about actually elevating it in my personal thing. One of the things I'm actually doing just for my own entertainment, I may release this to you guys if you want me to, is I'm going to list my top 10 favorite Voyager episodes when I'm done with this, because my opinions on that have already changed a little bit as I'm really ruminating, as I'm really analyzing, as I'm really reading up on the background info of these episodes. Where everything sits on the list is changing. I even found something to enjoy about Threshold, for God's sakes. Threshold! And in fact, even though I've been bashing it nonstop this whole episode, I'm actually kind of looking forward to Q and the Grey, because I'm going to go in that with a deliberately as open mind as I can, without preconceptions about how much I hate that episode, and really pay attention this time and see if it's better. It probably won't be, but I'm going to try. I'm going to do my best. So, given all that, up to now, let's just say Death Wish has a very strong component, very strong element of being at the number 1 slot. I guess we'll see how that turns out in the end. Nevertheless, it's been fun. I apologize for yanking your ear off. Thank you for keeping with me this whole time. I will see you later.